The problem of evil, it's a huge problem if you are making a case for God. And if you are an atheist and making a case against the God, then it's a big blessing. Because the claim of God, particularly the one that comes from Abrahamic religions, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, is that God is one and He is good and He created this universe. Then one can always ask this question, that why there is suffering in the world, why there is so much bad, so much evil out there. Why at this point of time innocent children are suffering and some even dying at this point. Why? And I'm sure you would know that I'm not the first one to ask these questions. These questions have been there for hundreds of years. And in that context only, I'm going to talk about Saint Augustine today, who was a Christian philosopher. He was born in Algeria and spent much of his life traveling. And when you read his accounts, particularly from the book called Confessions, you'd find that he led quite an interesting life. He's frank about his ideas, his own life in Confessions, and tells about various adventures or misadventures of his life. At some point, he even left Christianity. But then eventually he achieved something that we see even today in the Western tradition. The Western tradition, Western philosophy in particular, it goes back to the ancient Greece. And then there was a long period of Christianity. And after that, the period of Enlightenment. Now, if you look at it, then there doesn't seem much connection in these periods, that of ancient Greece and Roman Empire and the subsequent Christianity and into the Enlightenment period and today we live in. But there is something called Western tradition in terms of philosophy that we see today. And Saint Augustine played an important part. He brought the wisdom of Greek philosophy into the Christianity, and he kind of married them together. And of course, since he was a Christian and he was a believer, he always put dogma ahead of philosophy. So if there was any contradiction or a conflict between the Greek philosophy and Christianity, he would put Christianity ahead. And although you may argue that it's a wrong approach, but if you look at the history, it serves in the long run. It helps you preserve certain traditions in the form of dogma, and then that can continue for many generations. But anyway, we can argue on that on both sides. The point about the question of evil is quite interesting, and this is something that Saint Augustine discusses in great length. Just like the points I made earlier, that is, if God is good, surely He wouldn't allow such suffering to exist. And if He is all-knowing, that He knows that suffering exists in this world, and He is all-powerful, then He can prevent it. So doesn't that mean there is no God at all? Or at least, if He exists, then either He cannot get rid of human suffering or doesn't want to get rid of human suffering. So in one case He is weak, and in the other case He is immoral. You can see it for yourself as well, that these two claims, that there exists an all-powerful, all-knowing and all-good God, and the second assumption that evil exists in the world, these two things cannot exist together. And since we know that second thing, particularly the one that says that evil exists in this world, we see that that is true, then surely there is no God. Now, Augustine provides quite a few answers to this puzzle, and to me it seems like these are more postulations than really well-reasoned or well-argued statements. So to understand his points, we need to understand that if we see evil around us, the bad things happening and suffering that we see around us, it's usually of two kinds. One that comes from humans, that is, we plunder, murder, and destroy other creatures and the nature. And the second one is natural evils, which are caused by nature and over which we have no control. So Augustine goes by the argument that humans themselves, they are responsible for the evil in this world. That is, in order for us to have a free will, God couldn't have restricted us to just doing good things. Since we have this free will and we can do whatever we want, and we do evil things as well. And if there was no free will, then probably there wouldn't be any evil, at least from human side. One obvious problem that you can see in this explanation is that it explains only moral evils. It does not explain natural evils. But at the same time, like I said, most of his explanations seem like postulations because they come from theological point of view. They come from many assumptions already being made, such as that of God, such as that of the origin of Adam and Eve. So now when we move towards these natural evils, such as the coronavirus that we are witnessing today, there is literally no human fault in that. Of course, at some point you can blame certain governments, you can blame wherever authorities didn't do their job properly, but eventually it came from the natural world, and humans are not really responsible for the origins of this virus. So how do we explain this problem? So to explain these natural disasters and evils, Augustine, he starts with the biblical story of the fall of man. That is, God created a perfect world in which Adam and Eve had free will. And as you all know, unfortunately, they chose to disobey God and they sinned, which had two consequences. First, it brought about the corruption of human nature. Therefore, so every subsequent generation, it inherits that original sin. We all are sinners in some way. We can't be perfect human beings. Secondly, it brought about the corruption of God's own creation. So the creation which was supposed to be perfect, it then got corrupted, and all the material world that we see around us today, it's not perfect. So there are evils in that, and it causes suffering. So there are two things about suffering. So one which we bring upon ourselves through our own actions, and one about which we can't really blame ourselves, but eventually we'll have to blame Adam and Eve because they sinned, and that brought suffering onto the subsequent generations. But as you can see, there are obvious problems with these explanations. Once again, the big problem is it starts with the assumption of Adam and Eve, and there is no evidence and no logical reason to believe that was the case. But even if we were to believe all these things and Christian teachings themselves, then the Bible itself tells us about the sins of the father. That is, the son will not be responsible for the sins of the father and vice versa. So how then, in our case, we, the inheritors of the world of Adam and Eve, how can we bear their sins? Why do we have to suffer for the sins of Adam and Eve? How does it justify it then? So that's a big problem. But even bigger problem is the explanation of natural events such as earthquakes or even coronavirus. All these things, whether they occur because of some kind of sin or some kind of godlike power behind them, or are there natural underlying causes? And we know in the light of modern science that there are natural causes. Then how do we see these explanations and how can we justify them? One explanation is that the natural law itself was created by God, and it has to function according to that. And since it was created for the mankind and to serve the mankind, humans that live today and who lived in the past have to bear the responsibility. The idea here is that the material world itself is not really perfect. It is imperfect and it contains evil. Then you can ask again this question that if God is so perfect, why didn't He create the perfect world, perfect scenarios, perfect material world itself? And the answer to that is, once again, that can be contested and should be contested. The answer is that God is the perfect being, and no other thing that He creates, material or human or anything else, is going to be perfect. Otherwise, that would be same as God. So, since God is not going to create God, so that's why we are going to have an imperfect world. So, finally, you can read for yourself. And as I said, it's not just about the morality or Christianity. There are a lot of interesting things in his book called Confessions. Another book that you must read, and I will discuss at some point in the future, the book called City of God, where Augustine talks about how humans, no matter what, we cannot create perfect cities, perfect world, and it's going to be imperfect. And at some point, we have to accept that. His ideas in that book come from seeing the Roman Empire and how it was crumbling at that point, despite being very optimistic, believing in things like justice, believing in human values and human resources. So then he saw that, and Augustine was very much convinced that the city of humans, the city of man, cannot be perfect. And it is very different from city of God, which he imagines. So I will talk about that book in future podcasts. For now, I hope that you will read the book for yourself and see how he takes the certain ideas from Plato, and bring them together with Christian ideas, and then present a good philosophy, a good narrative for the people, particularly people of his lifetime. That is in the 5th century AD. But since we are in the 21st century, we can question these things, we can analyze and see their merits, their values, and also certain flaws in those philosophies. So it's quite an interesting type to live in.